Okay, I just clicked, got it. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming, and a special thanks to Tracy and her crew for putting all of this together. And it's my great pleasure to be part of the speaker series. So what I'm going to be talking about today are two systems of aggression and and what motivates each of them. And some of this stuff is old news, and I believe some of it will be new news. Let's get started. Okay, one thing that I did learn at MIT in graduate school there was you got to talk about what you're going to talk about, and then talk about it, and then say what you said. So here's a brief outline of what we're going to cover. We're going to start off by talking about anger and its motivation of reactive aggression. And then I'm going to introduce some new data about hierarchies of angry behaviors, which I believe represent different levels of anger. And then we're going to switch gears to the main topic, which is proactive aggression, for which there has not been a designated motivational system, and for which I will propose that there is, in fact, one. And then we'll talk about its complement or equivalent among other animals, which is offense. We'll then go into a brief review of the typologies of aggression in ourselves and other animals and their presumed equivalents, including the reinforcing value of proactive aggression and offense. Thank you, Sam Golden. We're going to talk about sort of the heart of things, which is phenomena of aggression, escalation, and persistence, which I believe is the strongest evidence for presuming that there must be central states within the nervous system motivating these behaviors. We'll then talk about some other phenomena which I believe are explained or explicable by the existence and characteristics of central states. And then we'll talk, if we have some time, about the neural circuitry of all of that. So that's where we're going. Let's go. We start out by reviewing some old knowledge about anger, which is that it can be triggered by self-imposed demands, physical distress and frustration, but most frequently and severely by someone else's negligence, disrespect, or threat to ourselves, our possessions, or valued others. The consequence of this is that a consequence of anger is that it motivates reactive aggression, pushing back on the threat. It's been suggested that anger evolved in order to push people to do that, because becoming aggressive is risky. You can lose things, you can get hurt. And so anger has evolved to drive people into the mode of reactive aggression. And one thing we know about that, consistent with that idea, is that anger does increase risk-taking and optimism about the outcomes of those actions. But what I want to call your attention to now is a little bit different, a little bit new, and that is that there is an association or correlation between the levels of anger we experience and what we do about it. If we had time, I would ask the audience, but we don't, so I will offer myself as an example. When I am mildly annoyed, I say bad words, and when I get really ticked off, I throw my keys. So we have this association between my experience of anger, my feelings of anger, and what I do about it. Second important point is that anger intensity, since I'm not angry all the time, Sometimes my anger level is 0, and then sometimes it mounts up, reaches a peak, and then declines. And so what we get under the, because we put those two things together, what we see is that there will be low severity behaviors when anger is low, and higher severity behaviors when anger escalates. What that amounts to is the hypothesis that in some situations you'll see only low severity behaviors, but in other situations you will see a mix of low and high severity behaviors, which is what happens when anger rises to its height, to a peak, and then declines. So having said all that, let's have a look at the data, which is new. And what we have here is a just published study in this year of breaking down aggressive interactions in occupational therapy workplaces, breaking them down by the kinds of behaviors which occurred. So you can see there were, based on a hierarchical cluster analysis, I came up with 5 levels of escalation. At the lowest level, you only see verbal 1 behaviors, which include sarcasm, hostility, harsh voice, talking over, cutting people off. But then at the next level, you see there's an addition of yelling and screaming and cursing. At the next level, you get all of that plus threat behaviors, both verbal and physical. At the level beyond that, then you begin to add in physical behaviors. And at the highest level of severity, what you see is things like slapping, hitting, punching, choking, and headbutting. What I would call your attention to in this organization is that there is at each level represents the addition of more severe behaviors as we go from here to here to here to here. Now, that was a small survey. There were 94 incidents reported. And then an old colleague of mine, Gabrielle Carlson, published a paper just this year, a much larger data set of the tantrums of clinic-referred children. And I looked at the data, and it occurred to me that it could be reanalyzed in terms of severity levels. And so I asked if she would be interested in having me do that, and she did. And this is the paper that is still being finalized, but take a look at what we found. So we have 4 levels of severity in these kids' tantrums. Now, these are exaggerated tantrums. They're called outbursts in the psychiatric community. But again, at the lowest level, we have kids who just argue with their parents. Then we have kids who do other things like scream and shout and destroy property. At still higher levels, at the 3rd level, we have all of this, plus they threaten, but they do not hit or kick. At the highest level, level 4, they do all of that, and there is a parent judgment that the kids need to be restrained. So what I take from this is that this hierarchical arrangement of progressively more severe behaviors is highly robust, because these samples differ in adult versus children, nature of the event, the reporter who was the participant in this case and the parent in that case, and the analytic strategy, Mike Potegal's version of hierarchical cluster analysis, versus professional statisticians' use of latent class analysis. But the outcomes are quite similar. Here's a question. Can behavior severity be used to quantify anger intensity? I'm not going to answer that, but I do have an answer. So if anybody out there is interested, ask me about that in the Q&A. Because now we need to switch gears and talk about proactive aggression. And that is aggression which occurs without anger. And examples include bullying, some bar fights, guys who like football players and hockey players who like to hit, professional and amateur and professional wrestlers, boxers, and so on, all of which amounts to proactive aggression, which is act committed without anger. Now, for those familiar with the literature on kids, you know that that there are quite different developmental trajectories and personality characteristics associated with those who are just reactively aggressive versus those who are proactively aggressive. There are also physiological differences. But what I want to point out in this context is that just as in anger-driven aggression, in proactive aggression, there's some risk. You can lose and you can get hurt. So I'm going to argue, and this is the main thrust of the presentation today, that there is a motivational state which overcomes fear and drives proactive aggression. And I've called this, for the lack of a more concise term, non-angry aggressive arousal. Let's see what else we can say about it. Okay, so what might its characteristics be? Well, it includes the impulses to hit, hurt, dominate, and even destroy. And acting on these feelings yields, acting on these impulses yields feelings of control, power, and positive reinforcement. It differs from anger in that it's self-initiated, not provoked. These are guys who go, and people who go looking for a fight. There are no feelings of being wronged or attributions of blame, and unequivocally it's experienced as positive, not negative, which is how most people experience anger. Examples were the ones that I mentioned, plus there's also something called in criminology, there's narrative criminology, which is when the sociologists and the criminologists go into the jails and listen to the stories of the inmates and what kind of fights they got into. Collins suggests that all instances of aggression are preceded by some feelings of inhibition, which must be overcome. And that corresponds to some of these narrative criminology stories about getting in the first punch just to get it started. If you combine this non-angry aggressive arousal with, my hypothesis is that if you combine this non-angry aggressive arousal with unemotional callousness, which is a recognized condition for juveniles, what you get out of that is everyday sadism, that is also internet trolls and people who like playing nasty jokes, and in a more exaggerated form, criminal sadists. The most severe form of this has been reported in youngsters who have been abducted into militias in Africa and South America and elsewhere, brutally beaten, usually drugged and rewarded, trained and rewarded for cruelty. And there are a couple of recent reports that this can produce a real strong non-angry aggressive arousal to really hurt others. And that when they do so, it's like a cathartic experience. They feel better after. Okay. As Tracy said, I'm very concerned about the multiple parallels between other animals and ourselves, way too many to mention in general, but in particular, we're going to be talking about offense, And well, let's just talk about it. Okay, so here's a brief review, very brief review of what I take to be the parallels between aggression in ourselves and other animals. Kids do rough and tumble play, which is pretty much equivalent to play fighting in other animals. We hunt, that would be like the predation of carnivores. Reactive aggression, which we just talked about, and that can be fear motivated, can be fear motivated, and in that case would be exactly like the defense that other animals show against predators and conspecifics. Is there an equivalent for anger motivation? I've been thinking about this for 50 years and I still don't know. However, what I am now convinced about is that that proactive aggression, which is what we're talking about now, is quite equivalent to what's been called offense in other animals. And we see offense in territorial disputes. Everybody's seen at least the videos and movies of the deer clashing antlers, of elephants and buffalo and other big rhinoceroses and other big animals crashing together. That is, those are examples of offense in a territorial dispute or for social dominance. Sometimes those two go together. Okie doke. So an important feature of offense is that it's positively reinforcing, and that's been shown multiple times over many years. We have some older studies in fighting fish back in the 60s and 70s. And what these graphs show is basically that animals will work for the opportunity to attack if they can win. The strength of the motivation is not as great as it is for food. Nonetheless, you get increases in mirror display over time in the fish, and you get exactly the same thing in mice, in resident intruder things where, in maze situations where mice run to get a reward in one arm or the other. And so you get very rapid acquisition for food and not quite so rapid acquisition for offense and more strain dependent. The most recent incarnation of this is operant behavior. In this particular case, mice have two holes they can poke their noses in. And if they poke their nose in one hole, they'll get an intruder to attack, and they'll show fixed interval behavior, and so on and so forth. Other indicators that this is that such behavior is reinforced, that nose poking is reinforced by the opportunity to aggress. There are major sex differences in this, and that males show this much more prominently than females do. What about the human equivalent? Well, my colleague, Dave Engel, and now unfortunately passed on, put together some historical examples of people fighting just for the fun of it. 15th century Venetians used to get into gangs and fight over whose bridge it was. As you know, Venice has lots of bridges. What were called faction fights were a feature at Irish county fairs. If you ever heard or used the expression that was a Donnybrook, that was an Irish fair that was particularly famous for the fights, the recreational fights that took place there. Dave also found evidence that American cowboys and Canadian loggers got into it on Saturday nights in the bar, and there was something called in World War I something, and other wars. Some soldiers, some fighters, not many, but some experienced what's called battle joy. This is an experiment by Martin Ramirez showing that inmates in reformatories find some level of aggression reinforcing whereas control subjects did not. And then we have the everyday sadists who enjoy vandalism, pranking, hazing, and so on and so forth, and aggression for thrills. The extreme form that I mentioned is being tapped by something called the appetitive aggression scale by Thomas Elbert. Just take a quick look at these items that are on the scale. Did you harm others just because you wanted to? Is defeating an opponent more fun for you when they bleed? Once you got used to being cruel, did you want to be even more cruel? During fighting, does the desire to hunt or kill take control over you? So this is the experience of the motivational system becoming dominant and running the behaviors. Where does this come from? Well, here's another parallel between ourselves and other animals, because we and other animals have a nucleus accumbens, shown here and here, and this is activated by dopamine release, and for both us and other animals, dopamine release is rewarding. It's rewarding in general for all sorts of behaviors, food consumption, sex, whatnot. But the news is that it is also true for offensive or proactive aggression, respectively. And here we just have some pictures of the accumbens in sagittal view. Okay. I promised you that I would talk about what I take to be the strongest argument for the existence of central states, of these central states which motivate offense and proactive aggression. And so this is my own sort of personal history. I came across this study by Bob Hind, which involved chaffinches being exposed to an owl and giving mobbing calls. And this is the, mobbing calls are species typical behaviors, which bring in other animals of the same species and quite often animals of other species who will then dive at the predator, the raptor in this case, and drive it away. So you'll notice that this is examples of mobbing calls in 3 different chaffinches, and in each case it increases over a few minutes and then decreases. And what you might think is, oh yeah, I know why, because the owl was horsing around and first it was closed and then, no, the owl was stuffed. It didn't do anything. It just sat there. So these changes are taking place within the individual birds, okay? More striking, and what really got me going, was this work of Walter Heiligenberg's, in which he had a male cichlid in a tank with lots of little cichlid fish, little fingerlings swimming around in it, and every so often the male would attack these fingerlings, up until the moment that he showed the male another adult male in a tube outside the tank, at which point the male fixated on that antagonist, on that conspecific threat, challenge, and just looked at it for the minute that it was exposed. But then as soon as the conspecific male was taken away, look what happened. We had a dramatic increase in the number of attacks on these little fingerling fish that were swimming in a tank, and that persisted for a while and eventually evaporated over time, with a time constant that I calculated from his data of about 2 minutes. Okay, so this is the persistence of aggression beyond the provoking stimulus. This had to have involved some central state. All right, here are 5 other phenomena that I promised that may very well be driven by driven by angriffsbereitschaft. And that's the name, the word that I took actually from Walter Heiligenberg to describe the central state in other animals, to acknowledge that it may be different from non-angry arousal in us. So, in a number of different species, it's been found that getting into a fight reduces anti-predator vigilance. My favorite story about that was a paper written by somebody named Colvin, who was walking across the landscape in the American Southwest, heard some noises, came over a rise and saw two voles fighting with each other. So preoccupied were they with each other that he reached down, grabbed them, and picked them up. Now, if as clumsy a predator as a human can do that, imagine what would happen to the voles if there was a hawk, a snake, or a fox around, okay? So getting involved in a fight is a bad idea and is testimony to the strength of the angriffsbereitschaft. We have the redirection of aggression, in which one animal which is attacked will then turn around and attack another. Common in primates. My favorite quote is this one. About hyenas, it is common to see a chain of redirection. Hyena A chases B, B chases C, C chases D, and D chases vultures. There's a picture. In at least hyenas and gorillas, the delay between being attacked and attacking others can be as much as 5 minutes, meaning that the state is being carried over. And then we have an equivalent in experiments on humans, triggered displaced aggression, which is somebody's provoked majorly by something or other. They don't have an opportunity to respond, and a little bit later, they're provoked in some minor way and they blow up. So again, this is a carry through of the central state. Motivational override, if you put two rats together who have been trained to escape from a shock box, but you individually, but you put them together and you start shocking them, they'll fight instead of escaping. So then they get both shocked and bitten. Another phenomenon, which I believe can be explained by angriffsbereitschaft, central state, is the contagion of aggression, and we're familiar with that from work on fighting in at hockey matches. When the hockey players get into it, so does the audience. When the audience gets into it, the players will. This is the work of Gordon Russell. Same in other sports, and recent studies have shown exactly the same in two species of primates. The interesting thing about that is they don't. This will happen. This will trigger aggression, not by when all that. The only stimuli they're getting is the sound of other animals fighting, not the sight. So they're not mimicking anything. Simply the sound of other conspecifics fighting is enough to trigger fighting. And then finally, I'm going to go out on a limb even more and suggest that these little rituals that some birds have of post-victory triumph ceremonies where they flap their wings and they give certain calls may be driven by a carryover of this aggressive arousal. And we have it too in our arm pumps and other things we do in victory. And this has been documented by David Matsumoto.
30 minutes.
Ah, excellent. Timing is good. Okay, so I think a major application of, or a major instance of activation of the central state is in threat. And threat precedes, threat typically precedes attack. And as the game theorists game theoreticists have reminded us it's less costly and less risky to threaten somebody into submission or into running away than to fighting with them. And what I'm going to propose is that this escalation, that this central state, non-angry aggressive arousal in us, it drives threat, and then when it increases, it drives full-scale aggression. So I just collected from the literature, gaze is a threat in us and other primates, and I just collected from the literature 4 papers which you can simply scan the titles of, showing how you go from visual threat to actual attack. You sort of don't have to read the papers, just the title tells you the story. Okay, so now we are talking about some brain systems. And this is a figure from Joseph Haller's work showing similar locations in the hypothalamus of neural circuits that drive different forms of aggression. And here we have the posterior hypothalamic triangle of Sano, a Japanese neurosurgeon, stimulation of which can produce aggression, and was the subject of the target for psychosurgery back in the old days, and currently is a target for deep brain stimulation, which in fact, according to at least 8 short reports, has the effect of inhibiting intractable aggression in low-functioning people. But a lot of my thinking has been driven by the work in the ventromedial hypothalamus by folks like Dayu Lin, Annegret Faulkner, and other folks who trained with Dave Anderson, showing a very highly specific neuronal responses which drive intraspecific aggressive behavior, including aggression sink in mice, which are the typical animals being studied, nose poking for aggression, tail rattling threat, decreased attack latency, increased attack intensity, and persistence of attack associated with activation in the ventrolateral portion of the ventromedial hypothalamus. In some, it's been argued that activation in these circuits is both necessary and sufficient for aggression. And there's a recent paper which postulates an aggressive state which can be modeled by some very complex modeling, mathematical modeling, and this is a trajectory of the aggressive state in the hypothalamus, which starts with threat and then in the red area winds up with attack. All right, what's my part in all of this? My part in all of this goes back to my interest in central states and a desire to measure them, which I did by developing a 2-trial situation in which there is a resident rodent and then an intruder is introduced. The resident is selected for its aggressive tendencies. It attacks the intruder. The intruder is withdrawn, and a second similar, if not identical, intruder is put in. And what you see is that there is a reduction in attack latency on the second trial. This is in female hamsters, and similarly for rats. You can ask the question, how long does this internal state, central state, last? So I did several studies in which I interpolated a delay between the first and second trial. And you can see that despite my anticipation that there would be a nice exponential curve like Walter Heiligenberg found, there seemed to be a two-phase thing. There's a reduction. This is the mean attack latency. This is after priming, and this immediately after priming, and then it seems to go back to baseline, but then drops again. So it looks like there's a two-phase set of processes that are activated by that priming trial. Same for, to my surprise, exactly the same for rats. Also, the same for 15-month-old kids. I had access to data in which mom put her arms around the kid, provoking protest and facial anger, and then did so again. The hold was for 30 seconds, and then 1 minute later she did it again. And what you see here are graphs showing that struggling, vocalization, and facial anger happened more quickly for more kids on the second trial. The two-trial situation in people. Okay. Now, what can we say about this process of escalation? And here I would appeal to your memories of what it's like to get into a squabble with parents, either when you were a kid or you as parents, and you start off at normal tones of voice, and then what happens? Anybody?
I lose my shit.
Yeah, you start to yell, right? Is this a deliberate policy, well thought out, carefully planned in advance? No, it's automatic, okay? So what we're looking for is mechanisms that can account for this automatic escalation in aggression within the usual aggression circuits. And in looking for this, I did way back when, I did some studies with CFOS to label neurons activated by priming. They turned out to be located in the medial amygdala. Lesions there, reduced aggression. But the important finding was that when I stimulated with high frequencies in this area, I saw a reduction in aggression, which was frequency dependent and maximum at 200 hertz. It occurred to me at the time that this might be accounted for, because this is high frequency stimulation, it might be accounted for by the phenomenon of short-term potentiation, which is a increase in the activity or the potency of synaptic connections, which is triggered by high frequency stimulation and lasts anywhere from a few minutes to an hour or two. Just about the time that this occurred to me, I decided that I wanted to scratch a clinical itch, left the neuroscience bench, and retrained as a clinical psychologist, which led to my work on tantrums as I was being a practicing neuropsychologist here in Minnesota. But I was interested in trying to pursue this and spent years bothering my colleagues still in the neuroscience business, would they have a look at this? Largely to no avail until I was invited to a meeting in Leiden by my colleague Menno Crook. And there I presented a PowerPoint explaining what I thought might be the case. And this was an illustration in the PowerPoint. You stimulate in the medial amygdala, you record in the ventromedial hypothalamus, and you see what happens after a fight. and you might see this increase in synaptic potentials, transient increase. Despite encouragement in Leiden, it didn't happen that way, and didn't happen until along comes our very bright, highly energetic, and indefatigable young fellow, Jacob Nordman, who it is my pleasure to know, who went from here to here, and then using optogenetic methodology, cutting edge optogenetic methodology, showed in fact that this was so. And this is one of the many figures in the paper that he and I published. He published and I tagged along. And this shows the synaptic potentiation that occurs after 10 minutes of fighting in mice. And you can see that it increases up at the 15-minute, after 5 minutes or so, up to at the 5-minute point, and then decreases after. Okay.
3 more minutes.
Yeah. I'm almost done. So, so yeah, there were 2 phases here of angriffsbereitschaft, and what Jacob has demonstrated may be the mechanism for this second phase of increased aggressive arousal in other animals. Right. I do have a couple more brain slides, but they're general, and so I'll stop at this point for questions and comments.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Mike. That was excellent. I have to say that you've said many things that I've enjoyed over the years that I've known you, but I think no, the owl was stuffed now takes first place. Really enjoyed that. So we'll take questions. If people could put up their hand, that'd be great. And then also, Mike, if you don't mind stop sharing your slides, that'd be great as well.
Okay.